Hi there, my name is Lindsay, I'm the data coach, and today we're going to be talking about biases that can show up in research. Now, for a lot of us, when we hear the term biases, we are probably thinking about things like racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, the whole lot. And certainly these kinds of social biases can have negative impacts on our work if we let them infiltrate our processing. But in research, bias is more of a technical term. A bias is a mistake that can show up at any point along the research process, from data collection all the way to reporting. And these types of mistakes in our processes can ultimately lead to mistakes in our results. And we want to do everything that we can to avoid making decisions about our programs, our policies, our strategies using bad or junk data. So here are 4 types of biases that commonly show up in research work that nonprofit organizations should be aware of. The first type of bias we're going to talk about is selection bias. Now, selection bias happens when a group or groups of people who should be involved in a research project are not invited to participate, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. For example, say that there is an executive director who wants to get staff feedback in advance of a strategic planning meeting. The ED creates this survey, sends it out, but only sends it out to senior level staff. That's an example of a selection bias error. What that ED should have done was sent that survey to the entire organization, because there may be staff who are not senior level that have really fantastic, great critical ideas that are going to be important for the organization's growth and development. To avoid a selection bias issue, make sure you're being really thorough and thoughtful about all of the people who need to receive your survey, participate in your interviews, whatever it is. It's also nice to get an outside perspective on those that you want to include, just to make sure that you're not missing anybody. The next bias we're going to talk about is procedural bias. Procedural bias occurs when there is something about the data collection process that swings responses in one way or another. A good example of this is when people don't have enough time to do the thing you're asking them to do. So if we look at that last example of the executive director, let's say that ED sent out the survey one day before the strategic planning meeting. Well, that's not really enough time for people to respond, so a few things are going to end up happening. Some folks are going to skip it altogether, so you miss out on their critical ideas. Some folks may rush through the survey, maybe misread some of the questions, end up giving answers that don't quite accurately reflect how they feel about certain issues. And to be honest, that ED is never going to have the time to analyze all those responses in anticipation of the meeting. That's too many potential mistakes to make that particular survey worthwhile, right? If you want to avoid something like this in the future, just make sure you're giving people plenty of time to respond to your survey, to sign up for those focus groups as a part of your data collection process.
The next bias we're going to talk about is a big one that I see in nonprofit surveys all of the time. And this is response bias. Response bias happens when we ask someone a question in a certain way that influences them to give a different response than they would otherwise. One way that this happens is when, say, a survey has really complex or confusing questions. And that can happen when we use a lot of acronyms or a lot of nonprofit jargon within our surveys. To avoid that, if you're going to include that kind of language, don't assume that everyone knows what you're talking about. Instead, spell out all your acronyms, define your jargon, or find a way to paraphrase it so that everyone will be able to understand the questions that you're asking. Response bias can also occur when a participant feels a bit of pressure to respond to a question in a certain way because of who's asking. Let's use a client feedback example to illustrate this. Let's say that there's a program director who is interviewing program participants, and she asks one of the participants, "So, tell me what you thought about the new program. Did you enjoy it?" that particular participant might feel a little bit of social pressure to say yes because they don't want to upset the staff member, or the power dynamics are such that they're in fear of consequences if they say no. That's bad news for the client who is in this uncomfortable, awkward situation, who doesn't feel like they can fully express themselves. And it's bad news for the organization because they're going to miss out on this client's feedback that could be really valuable in improving programs and services. To avoid this, be really mindful of who is asking your questions and the relationships between the question asker and the people who are responding. This is also a place where having a neutral third party come in can be really useful because it takes some of that social pressure out of the room. The last bias we're going to talk about is confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias occurs when we make assumptions about what the outcomes of our project is going to be. We use the data that supports our pre-existing conclusions, and we ignore the data, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that doesn't fit our framework. From my perspective, confirmation bias is one of the most dangerous mistakes that nonprofit organizations can make, especially when using data to advocate for policies. In my former life as a policy analyst, I certainly saw situations where it seemed like groups had picked out the policy they were going to advocate for, selected the arguments they were going to use, found data to support those arguments, but did not consider any information that may have contradicted their position. This can be a problem in lots of different ways. But primarily the problem is when you ignore data to the contrary, whatever your argument is, you could end up missing something really important. And you may end up advocating for something that is ultimately going to have unintended consequences for the people you are trying to help. This is a hard one to overcome. It requires us to be very honest with ourselves about what our biases might be or what our assumptions might be before going into a project. It's really important to take the time to interrogate your own thinking and don't let your previous assumptions influence the ways in which you're doing your data collection, your data analysis, and your advocacy work. So there you have it. 4 types of biases or mistakes that can show up in program evaluations, in needs assessments, or any other kind of project that involves data collection and data analysis. If you have a data question, please feel free to leave it in the comments below, and it could become the topic of our next video. Please like and subscribe to stay up to date on the latest videos, and thanks so much for watching. See you soon.